Hello and welcome to the Full Scottish Review of the Year, a series of programmes where we look back at the stories which have made headlines during the past year. Today we focus on Scottish politics and Scottish democracy. I'm Douglas MacKenzie and I'm joined in the studio by William Duguid, writer and blogger, and last time I described him as a fixture in the Perth Yes Hub, but so we'll just say he's a Wheel Kent face there rather.
Wheel Kent face is all right. Fixture sounds a bit like I'm a piece of furniture.
Indeed. I have two guests joining me virtually. The first is Richard Thomson, who was leader of Aberdeenshire Council previously and then MP for Gordon until this year, and a prospective candidate for Holyrood next year in the election. And I'm also delighted to be joined by Maureen Watt, long-term parliamentarian and now president of the SNP. So welcome to all three of you.
Hi.
Well, it's been a tumultuous year in Scottish politics, and looking back at the stories, it's a case of think, my goodness, was that just this year? So we start with the end. If that's not too paradoxical, and it was the end of the Bute House Agreement. I'm interested, Maureen, in what your thoughts on that were. SNP's experience in coalition, is it something to be repeated or something to be avoided at all costs?
Well, I think the event in itself wasn't very edifying. It was clear that the Greens were going to be having a conference to decide as a party whether they should continue with the Bute House Agreement, and there were various reasons, I think, that would have been put forward at their conference not to continue the agreement. So it was inevitable and correct that the largest party, i.e. the SNP, took control of the situation and were seen to be leading events and stopped the continuation of the agreement. It's a bit sad in a way because, you know, the Scottish Parliament, we should never forget, was set up and designed to be a situation, given the voting system, of minorities, and clearly from 1999 to 2006 there was a coalition of the Labour Party and the Lib Dems, which by all accounts was not that harmonious and, you know, had lots of disagreements, mostly behind doors, but not always. So it was difficult. And then, of course, the SNP under Alex Salmond upset the perceived wisdom of the Scottish Parliament in having a minority government between 2007 and 11, and then an amazing majority in 2011 till 2016. So I think Scots, I think voters in general prefer parties to get along. And I think in the Scottish Parliament particularly, the opposition parties have got a duty to make the Parliament work. And I think John Swinney is someone who is more able to reach out to other parties and have discussions, amicable discussions with other parties to get legislation through. So I hope and I think he will, you know, as long as the budget passes in February, that there should be possibility to govern fairly peacefully, should I say, until the election in 2026.
Thanks, Maureen. Turning to you now, William, as Maureen alluded to there, the end of the Bute House Agreement also was the beginning of the end for Humza Yousaf and replacement by John Swinney. What are your reflections on the change in leadership and what that's meant?
Well, I felt that Humza Yousaf, in his tenure as First Minister and SNP leader, really didn't get very much luck at all, and certainly not a fair crack of the whip from the media. At the same time, I'm not sure he ever quite got the confidence of the independence movement that he would be the person to lead us to independence. He had a fair attempt at it. I remember him talking very well at a Believe in Scotland rally just about a week before all of this blew up. But somehow he was just never in the right place at the right time. And it became inevitable when he called time on the Bute House Agreement that the wheels were rolling to replace him. John Swinney, since then, very much promoted as a safe pair of hands. Again, the independence movement is perhaps wanting a wee bit more than that, and that is perhaps one of the influences on SNP leaders and SNP First Ministers that is becoming significant. But certainly, in terms of the day-to-day politics, I think John Swinney has managed to calm things down just a little bit. I agree with Maureen that it's unfortunate that the coalition governments for which the Parliament is actually designed aren't necessarily working in the polarised environment that we now find ourselves. And also a minority government, such as the SNP is now running, is harder to operate than it was in the days of Alex Salmond, when he found it a bit more easy, I think, to work with the opposition parties because they weren't expecting an independence referendum to be around the corner between 2007 and 2011. So it makes life interesting and difficult, and the budget will be very interesting. I suspect the budget will pass, but there is a question as to whether John Swinney wants to appease the Greens or whether he wants not to have the Lib Dems voting against him. It will be tight, and probably that kind of disruption is something we can do without. So it's very much open for 2025 to see what happens next.
Thank you, William. Richard, you were something of an outsider to this, with all this going on in the Scottish Parliament and the Scottish Government, and you were watching from Westminster. What was your impression of the times, those troubled times?
Well, I started out as a bit of a sceptic about the Bute House Agreement, not because I had anything necessarily against the Greens or the policy outcomes that ended up in that agreement, but simply because I thought that once you were in an agreement like that, it was going to become very, very difficult to get out of it. Now, the reasons for it coming about, there was the possibility of an independence referendum at that time. Most of the nationalist movement, apart from maybe Angus Brendan McNeill, who was doggedly ploughing his own furrow on it at the time, had the view that it was very likely to be within the legislative competence of Holyrood to proceed with an advisory referendum. So having a pro-independence majority government was a good thing. But also, the other parties had circled their wagons in such a way that there was always a real risk of legislation not going through, or of ministers being picked off one by one in votes of confidence. There was a real logjam, appeared to be, in the Scottish Parliament at the time. So having a majority government got round that blockage that was put there by the way that the other unionist parties were working together. And that meant that theoretically, at least, some of the noise could be taken out of the day-to-day of government. It would allow the SNP, as the main partner in that government, to look ahead, to make a bit of political progress, to deliver on public services. And that was the rationale at the time, to make it easier to work in that Parliament. It never, though, seemed to quite work out like that. And certainly there was a great deal of hostility, first of all from unionist parties, because it seemed that the SNP and the Greens had perhaps spoiled their fun in some ways by being able to get business through Parliament unobstructed. But there was quite a lot of hostility to it amongst not just the Green membership, which grew and grew, but also amongst elements of the SNP membership and the wider voter base. Now, I don't always think that some of these criticisms, although they were very real, I didn't think they were always entirely fair. But nevertheless, it built up to a level where it was very, very difficult to ignore, and certainly it was clear that within the parliamentary group itself at Holyrood and the SNP, not everybody was happy with that set of arrangements. So, as Maureen has picked a key element there, when the Greens decided to go to their membership at a conference to decide whether or not to consider the Butte House Agreement, that was basically leaving not just the SNP hanging, but the government in Scotland hanging. And that was not a sustainable position to be in. So, to that extent, Humza Yousaf was right to seize the initiative and bring that uncertainty to a conclusion. But I'm minded of the saying that the definition of a diplomat is someone who can tell you to go to hell while leaving you looking forward to the journey and the destination. And whatever it was that Humza said in that room at 8:30 that morning, he certainly didn't leave the Greens looking forward to the journey or the destination. And I think, reverting back to that Parliament of minorities, it not only made the cost of doing business potentially a bit higher, but it certainly marked the end of the road for Humza Yousaf's time as First Minister. Now, I think a few things have changed since then. John Swinney, obviously, he's seen as someone who is a statesman in Scottish politics. He's an old hand at the budget negotiations. He's someone who the public regard well. He's seen as somebody who works with honesty and with integrity and with ability. And there's no doubt he's sorted out a lot of the issues and perceptions that people had round about the SNP and government. And the SNP and government is seen to be making its own progress and doing so under its own steam now. So that the budget that I think quite a few people, including myself, were a bit worried about ever being able to pass at the time the Butte House Agreement fell, I think will actually pass relatively easily this time. Because the other thing that's happened is Labour has landed itself in considerable difficulties as well. They and the Conservatives are under challenge from an insurgent party in Reform. The recent Norstat opinion poll shows the SNP up at 37%. It's shown Labour down 9% since the UK budget, and down more since the Scottish government budget as well. Support for independence up to 54% as well in that same survey. So it shows that the SNP has certainly steadied the ship, is once again winning the trust of voters in Scotland. And I think those numbers, if they're repeated in other polls, just goes to confirm my suspicion that actually, in contrast to most of the headlines we've seen throughout the year, that actually the only party that could have something to look forward to if a Scottish election were to be forced at this point in time would in fact be the SNP, with everybody else scrabbling over third and fourth place at the moment, and all being much of a muchness. But just to conclude, with support for independence up at 54%, I don't think it's any coincidence at all that those numbers have started to edge up on the basis of the Scottish government led by the SNP looking like it's got its act together and winning back the trust. Because for an awful lot of people who wouldn't necessarily regard themselves as dyed-in-the-wool nationalists, but who are nevertheless sympathetic to independence, that support for independence is contingent on feeling that other day-to-day concerns are being dealt with well and that they're being governed properly. So if that sense is coming back into it, I think that is very, very good news indeed for not just for the SNP, but for everyone who wants to see Scotland move on to independence.
Thank you. You've all pointed out difficulties with the coalition. I'm interested to get your view if we have a Holyrood election after the budget, or if it goes to, as planned, 2026. No party goes into an election to not win, and the intention is always a cracking majority. But should the SNP plan for a coalition after the next election, or should it, assuming it's the largest party, aim for a minority government as we have at the moment? Starting with you, perhaps, Maureen.
Well, no party goes into an election thinking that they're going to be in a coalition or in a minority. You go into an election to win outright. And we've seen in the relatively short life of the Scottish Parliament that an outright majority is possible. Now, the polls are not showing that yet, but as Richard said, the trajectory of the SNP is a very positive one. And I, like him, think that what Scotland and indeed the whole of the UK needed is a period of stability. And John Swinney, rather derogatory, is often called, somebody who's more of a manager than a leader. But I think that's precisely what we need in Scottish politics at the moment. And, you can see the fire in John's belly for independence, which has been there all his life since he joined the SNP at the age of 15, I think it was. So I think there's quite a long time in politics. A week is a long time in politics. So there's a long time to go till the election in 2026. Like your other contributors, I think the budget will pass. It doesn't need other parties to vote for it. They can abstain, and the budget will still go through. So I think that's probably what will happen. John, for weeks and weeks now, has been using First Minister's questions to get the fact across that the opposition parties would be committing political suicide, in his view, voting against the budget. So I am pretty hopeful that the budget will pass. There may be tweaks here and there, maybe to get the Lib Dems on board, for example. But I think that once the budget passes in February, as I said, there should be a period of relative stability up to the election in 2026. But hey, one never knows what's going to come in politics, do we?
One never knows, indeed. Thank you. With a fairly positive note, we'll move on from that to a more negative note, and that was the night of the general election. A very bad result for the SNP, after which the Unionist press was happy to write headlines that it was the end of the SNP, it was the end of independence, as the polls show. That is not the case. One thing which came out of it, that people were optimistic that at least dealing with the Labour government in Westminster, they would be more cooperative than the Tories had been. I'm interested in your views as to whether that has actually been the case. And it's probably appropriate to start with you, Richard. A particularly miserable night for you in Aberdeen. I was at the count that night.
Well, yes, obviously I was disappointed with the outcome, not just for myself, but also for a number of very good colleagues who really, through nothing they'd either done or not done, found themselves on the end of some pretty big reverses. Just to talk more about my own context, the seat that I'd represented, Gordon, lost a very significant part of the constituency that was in the north of Aberdeen, which Dyce, Bucksburn, Dainston and the Bridge of Don, which have always been pretty good for the SNP. I lost that to the Aberdeen North seat, and I took in some more rural, conservatively minded parts of Aberdeenshire to the north. Now, notionally, on those boundaries, I started nearly 4,000 votes behind. In the end, we clawed it back to just under 900. So I think had the election come a little bit later in the year, with the benefit of having John Swinney leading the party as a public face for more than a fortnight before the election came, I don't think it would only have been my own result that would have been more favourable for the SNP. But I think we got caught by quite a few things. There was the internal turmoil in the SNP, the continuing saga of branch form, the turnover that had been in First Ministers, the fact that the government seemed to be adrift. And the public noticed that. They noticed that we were beginning to look like an undisciplined rabble at times. And, parties that are divided do not win elections. That's the 101, the first lesson that any aspiring candidate or elected candidate either needs to learn or remember. So there was a lot of colleagues a few colleagues who did not make the best contribution that they could to the re-election of a good number of SNP MPs. But more significantly, there was a desire to get rid of the Tories. Now, in the context of UK media that is talking about the election as it pretty much is in England, it's very, very easy for the Labour Party in Scotland to say the only party that can replace the Tories is Labour. Now, of course, at previous elections, the SNP were the party that had replaced the Tories. In the 6 seats that the Tories still had in Scotland, the SNP were the challengers. We were the only people who could keep the Tories out. So mathematically, what the Labour Party was saying was nonsense, but nevertheless, it resonated with people that if you voted for a Labour candidate, you were somehow helping to get the Tories out, even if they either already were out, or even if it was in that particular seat only the SNP that could do the job. But because I think independence looked a distant prospect, not as some would have it because the SNP had gone soft, but simply because that was where we were in the aftermath of the Supreme Court judgment. People had the more immediate priority of the cost of living and dealing with that. And most of the SNP's internal polling, which I was a party to, showed that there was an awful lot of people who supported independence, nevertheless felt that replacing the Tory government at Westminster with a Labour government would be the best way of getting the action that they wanted in things like reducing fuel bills, perhaps making sure that pensioners were getting a better deal in winter, and you can see how well that's turned out so far. You can see the dent that Labour have had on their polling figures, particularly in Scotland, as a result of that. But nevertheless, people just felt that this was the wrong election for the SNP, and even though they didn't necessarily vote for the Labour Party with a great deal of love, just a number of things came together that meant that for a lot of people who, even if they were pro-independence inclined, just felt that this was an election where they wanted to vote Labour instead. Now, not all of them, by any stretch of the imagination, will be regretting that choice, although the evidence would seem to suggest that a great many are. But I think the SNP needs to be reflective on this and understand that we've got no entitlement to people's support. We've got no entitlement to people's loyalties. It's something that has to be replenished and re-earned. And for all that the Labour Party are now in considerable political difficulties under the pretty doomed leadership both of Keir Starmer and it would now seem Anas Sarwar, that's not the same as the SNP becoming popular again. So I think that hopefully now with John Swinney at the helm, with the focusing event on the horizon, not just of the Scottish budget, but also of the 2026 elections, I'm hopeful that people can remember what it is that we are in politics for and what people vote for us for. And yes, it's about independence and making progress in the Constitution, but there's a factor underneath that underpins everything, is that they want a united party that is competently delivering for the people of Scotland. I think that's what we lost the perception of being for some period of time over the last couple of years. And as I say, I'm hopeful that there are signs there that has been remedied, at least in part, and that over time we will continue to rebuild that trust. But that is my perception on the factors that came together to deliver what was certainly by the standards of the previous 3 elections, a pretty rotten set of election results for the SNP. And as I say, I hope that and I see signs that the party has taken some learnings from that.
Thank you, Richard. William, that's a good summary there from Richard of the past. Looking to the future, I said in my introduction that we hope that with a Labour Party in Westminster, it might be easier to deal with than with the Tories. I wonder what your thoughts on that are, if that is possible. I'm thinking particularly about the winter fuel payment and that being announced in the budget. But because it spans a devolved area and also Westminster responsibility, that it would be necessary to get data from the Department of Work and Pensions to see who exactly in Scotland would be eligible for that, which sounds like an excellent stick to put in the spokes of the wheel.
Yeah. I think it's not been a good relationship, and it certainly hasn't been an upgrade on the relationship that the Scottish Government used to have with the Tory Government, which itself was pretty ropey. And some of the attitudes and rhetoric from Labour politicians, and particularly this idea that, well, if the Scots don't want this, then let them mitigate it, when clearly the budgetary constraints on them make that impossible, and the other logistics, as you mentioned, make it impossible. That's not a step forward, and I think that is partly what's leading people to get even more fed up with the Labour government than they otherwise would be. I think there are noises about cooperation, and John Swinney has tried to take the view that he's talking to the UK government, but they seem to want to reset devolution just a wee bit, and it's almost a case of the usual Labour thing of wait till we come and fix you, and that's really not consistent with the wish of the Scottish people to perhaps make a bit more of the decisions for themselves. So not an encouraging start, but of course generally not encouraging for the Labour Party. One of the straplines we're going with in the hub for many things, we've had it with a picture of freezing pensioners, we've had it with the National's Waspy Women headline, is vote Labour and wish you hadn't, come in for a chat. And that maybe is one of the things that will be a feature of the next year or so leading up to the 2026 election. Labour have got a long way to go to regain even the level of support they had at the election, I think, earlier this year. And it will be very interesting to see what happens. And I would just say one other thing before going, which you didn't ask. The other factor that's going to feature in 2026 is Reform UK, which polled consistently between 2,500 and 3,500 in Scottish seats in July, 7% in Scotland as opposed to 14% in England. But what effect that might have on the 26th election, particularly on the list, maybe throws some of the calculations out of the window a wee bit.
Thank you, William. Maureen, we've spoken several times on evening programmes on Broadcasting Scotland about results in council elections, and I know you've done a lot of campaigning there. Results for the SNP have been mixed. Can we take anything for that in looking forward towards the next election?
I think, first of all, we need to remember that a lot of the by-elections have been caused by Labour councillors being elected as MPs to Westminster. So they weren't, as the mainstream media say, losses for the SNP. They were simply a return of the status quo, i.e. a Labour councillor being replaced by another Labour councillor. That said, we haven't made as many gains as we would have liked to see, although we did increase our representation in Dundee and picked up seats in Stirling and Perthshire, Argyll and elsewhere. So there's still a lot of work to do in persuading people on the doorstep to give us their trust, as Richard said, give us their trust again. So there is a lot of work to be done there. If I could just return to the relationship with Westminster, I think Keir Starmer, as we've seen, particularly in recent days and weeks, is returning to the sort of Blairite type government. And Blair, remember, thought of Scottish Parliament as a parish council and not the governments of equals that is really what it should be. So I think your other contributors are right that Starmer doesn't really, or he hasn't shown yet that he gets Scotland, and I think it's going to be difficult going forward. He's going to say the right things, but whether the push comes to shove, that he really understands devolution, and it's more important, for example, in the Northern Ireland context, but also in Wales. So I think, for example, in the British Irish Council, there needs to be a complete reset of how those work, and also, um, there's been a lot of announcements about, for example, in the last few days, money for potholes in England. Are we making sure that we're getting the consequentials on all these things, which are out with normal budgets? So I think there's a lot to reset in relationships between the various governments.
Thank you, Maureen. Well, elections are temporary, or they have a fixed period. There was one event which overshadowed almost everything in Scottish politics this year, and that was the death of former First Minister Alex Salmond in North Macedonia on the 12th of October. We've produced programmes on his legacy and tributes to him. He would clearly be very pleased with the polls at the moment and the growth in independence. Now, Maureen, you have known him for longer than anyone else on the programme. What are your reflections on what he's left behind, and has he been a factor in the growth of support for independence, do you think?
I think that's undoubtedly the case. I mean, when he came back to lead the SNP prior to the election in 2007, it was with a determination that we'd not seen in the SNP before, to take us, as the media have said, from a fringe party, which we weren't. We'd been on the scene for a long time, but into government. And I don't think anybody, and certainly those of us who had um, campaigned and stood for the party since the late 70s, never thought we'd see ourselves in government, and had to pinch ourselves all the time that we were actually making huge decisions that affected the lives of people in Scotland. So undoubtedly he has had a huge influence on the support for independence up to when he resigned in 2014. Indeed, some people have said that he shouldn't have resigned then. I suppose it's the thing that politicians do. Cameron did it when he lost the referendum on Europe. Since then, it's been a downward spiral and disappointment. His death was a shock, but not necessarily unexpected, because he wasn't a well man. And his leadership of the Alba Party, in my view, certainly hasn't helped the cause of independence. And it'll be a case of waiting and seeing in the next few months what his legacy for Alba will be, who will step up to be leader of Alba. I've not heard much in terms of grapevine on that. Maybe Richard knows a bit more. But the idea of continuing legal battles seems to me a bit ridiculous and not helpful to independence.
No, thank you. Well, I'll turn to Richard and Maureen, ask you a question. Perhaps you do know more about Alba and the future, but more particularly, I'm interested in your thoughts on Alex Salmond, and did his tragic death actually bring independence up the pecking order in what people were thinking about in Scotland?
I'm not sure either about having the inside track and what people in Alba might be thinking about anything, or indeed whether Alex' sad and untimely passing has given a bit of a fillip to the independence polling numbers. Look, I was present at the memorial service at St Giles. It was a magnificent service. It was very fitting. I think Alec would very much have enjoyed being there had he been able to. And inevitably, I think it's caused a lot of people to focus a bit more, think perhaps a bit more than we have had an opportunity to recently, about what is it that we want independence for? What is it that unites us? Regardless as to what's happened in the past, what is the way forward? Because we've found the democratic route currently. I'll say it's blocked off. I don't believe it's completely blocked off, but certainly Alec's strategy for achieving independence still seemed to be very much based on winning a democratic and legitimate route to independence at the ballot box. And it had always been founded on the ultimate threat that you could go to the Supreme Court and win confirmation for it there, or at least face down Westminster with the prospect of them having to take the Scottish Government to court and losing it. So, I think that it's focused some debate around about that internally, maybe some reflection internally in the independence movement as to whether it's been decisive in moving independence support up in the public at large. I think remains to be seen. I think that support for independence is a great deal more resilient than the loyalty that people or affection that people might have for one or more or other individuals. But there's certainly no doubt that the foundations that Alec laid as a leader of the SNP in both terms, the way that he embraced New Scots for independence gave us an unimpeachably civic background to our call for independence, the credibility that he gave us in Scotland's boardrooms, the way that he was able to speak and connect, and popularise independence. I mean, the reason I got involved in the SNP was because I was very, very impressed with Alec and the way that he led the SNP and the vividity with which he was able to put the arguments about why Scotland would be better self-governing, not just to the extent that we get under devolution, but why we would be better being completely independent and moving on from the situation we're in of being devolved and developing that devolved parliament into the fully sovereign parliament of an independent Scotland. So, I think that those of us who've been around a while, we've got lots of reasons to be grateful to Alec. I've got a lot of reason to be grateful to him personally. He gave me the chance to work for him, and although we were never particularly close personally, certainly I had every reason to be grateful to him for the opportunities he gave me. We worked well together when he was the MP for Gordon and I was the leader of Aberdeenshire Council, and I think that there's a great deal that we owe to him. Obviously, his more recent time in politics is something which divides opinion a bit more. I think that there are complexities in that time that people are struggling to wrestle with, or still wrestling with. But certainly, when I remember him, I want to remember that titan of the independence movement who was able to take us to the cusp of independence, and with some regret that the next time that we are pushing full tilt for independence as we were in the campaign for 2014, we're not going to hear his voice or have his ability to cast arguments at our disposal in the way that we did then, because I would have liked to think, perhaps naively, that there was perhaps still a role for Alec in some way in terms of taking our refreshed case for independence back to the people of Scotland.
Thank you. An interesting point, William, that Richard makes there, that independence, the movement, is more than any individual. But it seems to have been an argument exercised often by those opposed to independence. That's the end of Alex Salmond. That's the end of independence movement. The same argument was trotted out with Nicola Sturgeon when she resigned. You meet also people who are undecided in the Perth hub. What have you heard from them about Alex Salmond and their thoughts?
Well, I think I haven't heard from too many people who are directly opposed to Alex Salmond. Maybe they don't come into the hub just at the moment.
Very wise.
What I would say is that for people who were at least sympathetic to independence or independent supporters, his death did actually unite the movement in sorrow, if you like, or in at least a regard for his political legacy from 2014. We would never have got where we got if not for him. And there is an extent to which the independence movement has to get over the big personalities and start to work for itself and create its own results, because otherwise we're going to be in a bit of a vacuum. But certainly it did, locally at least, bring people together when he died, and that hasn't altogether gone away, and that's a good thing to see. And I don't think that's what has made the figures go up. I think there are other things involved in that. But having a more united movement, as we may discuss later on, will be a good thing. 3 other quick recollections about Alex Salmond. One of his last tweets was the very opposite. Scotland is a country, not a county. And that was with regard to the British Irish Council, which we mentioned just before. And that's a good sort of slogan to go out on, I think. That is the way we need to be thinking. And the other thing I would say, going back to the possibility of the legal side coming back, ridiculous or not, it's going to come back, because the people who think Alex Salmond was wronged are not going to let it go. And as a movement, we have to accommodate that and basically, if you like, work around it. I don't think it will necessarily work to the benefit of the direct independence campaign, because it will look terribly like a split, but we need to work around it because it is going to happen. And to a certain extent, because it is disputed, whatever folk may think about it, there are certainly 2 sides to what people think. We need to know to some extent what the truth was, and we need to be confident enough for the truth to come out and live with it and move on.
Thank you very much. No one will have failed to notice that this year marked the 10th anniversary of the independence referendum, and it was not celebrated, marked by various events. But that's done and dusted, and now it's time to look to the future. I want to start with you, William, because you said in answer to an earlier question that a safe pair of hands for independence might not be enough. So what do you think the future holds, and what does the future need for the independence movement?
I think what the future needs for the independence movement is to get itself together, not necessarily unite, because unity is impossible. I think unity of purpose is possible. We have to not get in each other's ways. We have to not argue, but we also have to organise ourselves and not wait for the politicians to do it, because the SNP, the Scottish Government, has got other things to be thinking about. It does have to think about being elected. It does have to think about governing Scotland. We are the ones who should be focusing on independence, and we need to organise ourselves better in 2025. Locally, we've certainly got that in mind, but also nationally, there have been, to my mind, 3 separate initiatives just in the last few weeks for parts of the independence movement that weren't previously talking to each other to at least be having a dialogue, to try and, if not have the unity of purpose, then not be slagging each other off and not be an inhibiting factor for one another. And that needs to go on, and we need to work out a way actually to do what we absolutely must do before we get anywhere with independence, which is to sustain the rise we've seen in the polls for independence and to convince more people that independence is the way forward. And we just aren't having that conversation enough, not because we're lazy about it, but because people aren't engaging. We need to engage them. We need to come up with the arguments. We need to come up with the thoughts and the challenges to their position that will make them think about this. And that's our big challenge in 2025. I'm actually fairly optimistic from the last few weeks, really since those talks have been going, that we can do this. But it's not going to be easy, and we're going to need to work at it.
Thank you, William. Maureen, as president of the party, I mean, you sit on the on the party council, so you have a good view of policy. What do you see as the immediate and medium term way ahead?
Well, I think the party has got a lot to do internally to make itself election ready for 2026, and that work is ongoing, and we will be ready. But I think William's right that in terms of increasing the number of people who support independence, and I think we have to get it up from 54 to over 60, to 60 at least. I think it was Alistair Jack, he said he wanted to see the polls consistently at 60% or above, although, you know, the Westminster politicians will come back and say we want more. And you'll never forget Labour having, what was it, they wanted to see, well, they counted the dead in the referendum in 1979. Anyway, I think we need to see more activity from like teachers for yes, health workers for yes, trade unionists for yes, and the hubs like Williams throughout the country. It can't all be left, as William said, to the SNP, who have also the government of Scotland to run. If the SNP are not doing well, then independence won't do well. Only the SNP in government can deliver independence. But we need to see more activity in the various groups, persuading people within their professions and workplaces of the merits of independence. Business for Scotland does a great job in providing loads of data on the economy. And we've got to focus, not on the process of gaining independence, but the reasons why Scotland needs independence and desperately needs independence.
Thank you, Maureen. I want to move on to another topic which is connected with what you were saying there, Maureen, and that is the influence of various groups in Scotland pushing the case for independence. The most obvious source of discussion around independence is the media in Scotland, and as we know, it's a pretty hostile media for the independence movement. So I'm interested to know what can be done to, not to change that, but to mitigate it. So I'll come to you first, Richard.
Ooh, God, if I knew the answer to that, I'd probably still be elected. Look, I think there's a number of things here. In Scotland, we've got this uniquely perverse situation where you've got somewhere around about 50% of the population supports independence. On a good day, you've got anywhere between about 40 to 45% of the country supports or is supportive of the current party in government, albeit 45 is maybe a bit optimistic at this point, but I like having something to aim for. But yet, there's not a single daily newspaper that backs them. And, you know, I'd exclude the National from that because while I'm very fond of the National, you know, it certainly is not a pro-SNP paper, albeit it's certainly pro-independence. I think we have a broadcast media where even the mighty BBC is having its budget cut back and cut back and cut back. That inevitably hits overall editorial standards, even if individual presenters and producers might be excellent. I think for a long time, and I've raised this at the highest level with BBC Scotland and the BBC, they're far too reliant on a bunch of absolute chancers and charlatans round about Tufton Street in London, which are basically funded by the Koch brothers and other American billionaires, pumping out a noxious right-wing neoliberal agenda where they take these bright, shiny, happy, clappy neoliberal evangelists and pop them on panels to create the impression of debate and diversity of opinion, when actually the opinion that they provide is entirely homogenised and corporately paid for. Within Scotland, I think we've got a problem, as we have across the UK, that too much, particularly the BBC's coverage, is led by those print newspapers, mostly owned by proprietors who frankly wouldn't spit on the SNP or the cause of independence if it was on fire. So, you're always battling against that. Now, I think that for a politician to complain too much about the media is a bit like a sailor complaining about the winds and the tides, because in actual fact, you can trim your sails to it. And I'll give an excellent example. Dave Duguid, the MP for Perthshire and Angus Glens, excellent former colleague of mine. He was in Good Morning Scotland a few days ago. He came across some fairly robust lines of questioning about the WASPy issue from the Good Morning Scotland presenter. Now, there's a whole lot of nonsense there about how biased this presenter apparently is. She gave him a tough time, but Dave gave more than as good as he got. And frankly, having people on air who are our representatives, who are willing to stand in front of cameras and microphones, even when the going is a bit tough, and who understand their brief, are confident in their arguments, and who are prepared to give it straight back and speak directly to the people of Scotland, then it doesn't take too much skill or guile to be able to get round any, not an agenda, I would say so much, but any contrary framing of your argument. All it needs is confidence, ability, and an understanding of your brief and the time and preparation. And then we need to be making sure that we are absolutely, in all democratic forums, whether that's Westminster, especially at Holyrood as well, we need to be making sure that we make the most of that, because actually, I think that in those kinds of settings, you can come across quite well. People feel you've had a bit of a grilling, but if you've given as good as you've got, they may not particularly like you as an individual. They may not particularly like the cause you represent, but they'll come away with a lot more respect for the arguments that you're putting forward. And just to go back, I think that was one of the things that Alex Salmond used to excel at when we were in a party of 3 MPs out of 650 odd at Westminster, no Scottish Parliament, but nevertheless took SNP support from 14% in 1987 up to 21% by 1992, and who, as you know, with the team that he built around him, helped to take us on. We had team media performers in that team in opposition in Holyrood who went on into government, people like Nicola Sturgeon, people like Mike Russell, who could be people like John Swinney, who knew how to get their points across confidently and robustly. And I think that we've got no shortage of good media performers like that just now in our ranks. I would just like us to see more of them and to be a little bit less hesitant, in fact, a lot less hesitant sometimes at pushing back on that confrontational journalistic approach that we're often encountered with. And that gives your supporters confidence when they're having discussions with family members, with friends, with work colleagues, and it begins to feed through as well, because no proprietor wants to be seen as being completely against the views of their readership. And I think there's an awful lot of room there for ordinary politically minded people as well to write in, use the letters page as well, challenge the prevailing editorial orthodoxies of our newspapers, because, as I say, nobody wants to be seen to be against that. And you need to create the environment in which your views are seen as the norm. And I think we've seen a concerted effort to try and delegitimise the SNP in government, to delegitimise the cause of independence. And frankly, I think what we need, all of us, is more confidence and make our own mood music instead of starting to feel a bit despondent about some of the mood music that is being enthusiastically created by those who are not politically well disposed to us. So let's be confident in our arguments, in ourselves, whether we're elected, whether we aspire to be elected, or whether we're foot soldiers. let's be confident in ourselves and in our arguments, and put those arguments about why the best status for Scotland is to be completely self-governing and independent, and why that is the constitutional settlement superior to all others, why the SNP and government is doing the best job that any party could be expected to do in Scotland. And when you've got more of that, I think that you end up with more of the country feeling that you're a cause worth supporting, and they'll be on your side as a result of that.
Thank you, Richard. Encouraging. However, that's one side of the argument, Maureen. The SNP has never lacked very good speakers who can get a point across, media savvy, and I mean, we have it with Stephen Flynn, we have it with Kate Forbes. But the way people consume news has changed hugely since I was a kid. You don't sit down and read a newspaper from cover to cover or watch the evening news. It's now into sound bites, and on the print media, people see the headlines when they walk past the newspapers in the supermarket. All these Scotland bad, SNP bad headlines, without ever looking at the story. There's got to be a case for modernising the approach to the media, is there not?
Absolutely, and while I agree totally with Richard that our own spokespeople need to be more confident and take on some of the rubbish that comes in terms of questions from mainstream media reporters and interviewers, like Dave Duguid, like John Swinney, Kate Forbes, Keith Brown, who's often on, excellent. But I think more of our elected politicians need to be more confident in putting forward the arguments. But you're right. We need to be embracing social media a lot more, and I think in the restructured SNP HQ, there needs to be much more emphasis on digital content. I mean, when you see somebody coming from absolutely nowhere, having videos on TikTok of him riding bareback on a horse, getting the largest number of votes to be president in the first round, you absolutely see the influence of social media. So I think the Labour Party are pretty good on digital media content, but the SNP, where we used to be far ahead of the others, needs to up their game substantially in that area.
Thank you, Maureen. You're in a very social media in the hub that you're meeting people there. What are your thoughts of coping with the hostile media in Scotland?
Well, we recognise that we're up against it, and we simply have to do better. We have to do all of things better. I totally agree with what Richard said about the politicians on when they're being grilled in the media, standing up better. But the movement as a whole, there is more you can do. Maureen mentioned. I think it was Maureen, mentioned letter writing. We need to do that as a movement. We need to do it in an organised fashion in local groups, targeting local press, keeping subjects alive, answering each other, backing each other up. We have to go to places. This is an existential campaign, so we need to be doing this in the next year. We need to go to places where we wouldn't ordinarily wish to tread. We need to go onto the phone-ins. We need to deluge Col K and others with the pro-independence point of view. Make sure that gets heard. If your hub's got a television screen pointing at the main street, then you need to use that better. We've got 2 loops that run all the time. We need to think of some new content. That basically is your rebuttal unit. If it comes to it, don't wait for the politicians to produce the rebuttals. Do it yourself. If there's a big news programme in a day and you've got the time to put together a few JPGs that blow that argument away, stick it out there. We just have to put aside all the sort of feeling, we can't do this, and organise ourselves just for a short period of time to basically put ourselves on a war footing as far as information is concerned. get as much out as we possibly can. We'll still be outgunned, but we might hit just enough people to take us where we want to go. So that's what I want to see. That's my New Year's wish for 2025, that the independence movement fights back with what it's got. It's a martial art. You can do it. It's just, it needs thinking about, it needs organising.
Thank you very much. Well, that's it for this review of Scottish politics, put to bed for another year. Before I go, I just want to remind you that at Broadcasting Scotland, we depend on the generosity of our supporters. To everyone who has donated and to everyone who has signed up to make a regular monthly payment, thank you very much. We set our current fundraising target in April, hoping to reach £36,000 by the end of this year. It's now December and we've raised almost 20,000, just over half of our target. However, to pay our bills and survive, we urgently need to raise at least 12,000. We've borrowed £12,000 to enable us to survive for now, but the pressure is still on and we do need to find enough regular donors to give us financial security. We face costs of over £4,000 every month, but only receive donations of around 2,500. We need more regular subscribers, but we need also to clear our debts. We are at crisis point and really need to increase our donations to be able to pay our bills and to survive. Our programmes will always be free to view. However, if you can afford £5 a month, please consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter and please donate whatever you can afford. Thank you very much to my guests today, William Duguid in the studio and remotely, Maureen Watt and Richard Thomson. And thank you at home for watching, wherever you are, whenever you're watching. I hope you're enjoying your festive holiday and all the best for the new year. From me, goodbye.